For 15 years, she'd been Sister Margaret, the organist who arrived early, stayed late, and knew every hymn by heart. The congregation thought her calm during crises came from deep faith. They didn't know it came from years of ministering to dying soldiers under enemy fire in Afghanistan. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful tale of hidden service and divine protection, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These narratives honor the warriors who continue serving, just in different ways. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church sat on the corner of Elm and 3rd Street, a brick and stone sanctuary that had served the community for over a century. Every Sunday morning, the Gothic arches filled with golden light, streaming through stained glass windows depicting scenes from Christ's ministry, and the ancient pipe organ resonated with hymns that had comforted generations of faithful souls. At exactly 8:30 a.m. every Sunday, Margaret Hayes could be found at the organ bench, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced precision. She was in her mid-50s, with silver-streaked hair always pulled back in a neat bun, wearing modest dresses that never drew attention. To the 200 regular congregants who filled the pews each week, she was simply part of the church's foundation, reliable, gentle, and devoted to her ministry of music. Margaret had been the church organist for 15 years, ever since she'd moved to town after what she described as completing her service work. She lived alone in a small apartment 2 blocks from the church, kept to herself mostly, and seemed to find her greatest joy in coaxing beautiful music from the century-old instrument that had been her responsibility since 2009. The congregation loved her for her consistency and spiritual sensitivity. She never missed a Sunday, never played a wrong note, and somehow always chose exactly the right hymn for Pastor William's sermon. During funerals, her music could bring comfort to the most grieving hearts. During weddings, she could make even the simplest ceremony feel sacred and joyful. During the Christmas and Easter services, her arrangements transformed the familiar hymns into something transcendent that left not a dry eye in the sanctuary. What they didn't know was that Margaret's musical precision came from years of military discipline learned in some of the Army's most rigorous training programs. Her calm during emotional services came from experience comforting soldiers in their final moments under the most harrowing circumstances. Her ability to read situations and respond appropriately came from serving as a military chaplain in some of the most dangerous places on earth. Captain Margaret Hayes, U.S. Army Chaplain Corps, had spent 12 years ministering to troops in Iraq and Afghanistan during some of the most intense combat operations of both wars. She'd held dying soldiers in forward operating bases, conducted memorial services under rocket fire, and provided spiritual guidance to men and women who faced death daily in service to their country. She'd earned a Bronze Star for her actions during a Taliban attack on a field hospital, where she'd continued ministering to wounded soldiers while mortar rounds exploded around them and medics worked frantically to save lives. But that was a lifetime ago. Now she measured her service in hymns and prayers, in the quiet comfort of Sunday morning rituals, and in the simple pleasure of helping a community connect with something greater than themselves. It was healing work, both for her congregation and for her own war-weary soul. The morning of November 15th began like any other Sunday. Margaret arrived at the church at 8:15 a.m., unlocked the sanctuary with her own key, and began her pre-service routine. She checked the hymn numbers Pastor Williams had requested, adjusted the organ stops for the morning's music, and ran through the prelude she'd chosen, a gentle arrangement of "Be Thou My Vision." By 9:45 a.m., the sanctuary was filled with its usual Sunday crowd, families with children fidgeting in the front pews, elderly couples who'd been attending for decades, young professionals seeking spiritual grounding in their busy lives. The atmosphere was peaceful, reverent, and exactly what Margaret had learned to treasure about civilian life after years of ministering in war zones. Pastor Williams stepped to the pulpit at exactly 10 a.m. and opened with the traditional greeting that had begun services at St. Matthew's for over a century. "The Lord be with you," he said, his voice carrying easily through the sanctuary's excellent acoustics. "And also with you," the congregation responded, their voices blending in the familiar ritual. Margaret began the opening hymn, Holy, 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 letting the organ's rich tones fill the sacred space. She'd played this hymn hundreds of times over the years, but it never lost its power to center her spirit and remind her why she'd chosen this quiet life of service over the chaos of military chaplaincy. The service proceeded normally through the first reading, the psalm, and the gospel. Margaret provided musical interludes between each section, watching the congregation through the small mirror positioned above her music stand. It was an old habit from her military days. Always maintain situational awareness, always know what's happening around you, always be ready to protect your people. Pastor Williams had just begun his sermon about finding peace in troubled times when Margaret noticed something that made her blood freeze and her military training snap to attention. 3 men had entered through the rear doors of the sanctuary, but they weren't moving like late arrivals looking for seats. They were moving with purpose, scanning the room, positioning themselves to control the exits. Margaret's training kicked in immediately. These weren't worshipers. These were threats. She continued playing softly, providing background music for the sermon while conducting a tactical assessment of the situation. The men were dressed in dark clothing, carried large bags, and had positioned themselves at the main entrance, the side door, and near the altar. Classic formation for controlling a space and preventing escape. Through her mirror, she could see that Pastor Williams hadn't noticed them yet. He was focused on his sermon, his back turned to the congregation. The worshipers were listening attentively, unaware that their peaceful Sunday morning was about to become something else entirely. Margaret made a decision that drew on 12 years of military chaplain training and countless hours spent in crisis situations where lives hung in the balance. She shifted from the gentle background music she'd been playing to something louder and more attention-getting, the opening notes of "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." The sudden change in volume and tempo caused Pastor Williams to pause and look back at her. Their eyes met, and Margaret gave him the slightest nod toward the rear of the sanctuary. Pastor Williams was a smart man who'd learned to trust Margaret's instincts over their 15 years of working together. He followed her gaze and immediately saw what she'd already identified. The pastor's face went pale, but he didn't panic. Instead, he smoothly transitioned from his sermon to an impromptu prayer. "Let us bow our heads and pray for God's protection," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. As the congregation bowed their heads, Pastor Williams made eye contact with the ushers and gave them subtle hand signals that Margaret recognized from her military service, signals indicating immediate threat and need for crowd control. That's when the men at the back of the church made their move. "Nobody move!" shouted the leader, pulling what looked like an assault rifle from his bag. "Everyone stay exactly where you are." The sanctuary erupted in screams and panic. Children started crying, adults dove under pews, and the peaceful Sunday morning dissolved into chaos and terror. The 3 armed men spread out to better control the crowd, shouting orders and waving their weapons. But Margaret Hayes didn't panic. She'd been in situations like this before, just in different uniforms in different countries where the stakes were life and death. She'd ministered to congregations of soldiers while under enemy fire. She'd provided comfort and leadership when everything was falling apart. Most importantly, she knew something the attackers didn't. The church's layout included features they hadn't considered, and the organist's position gave her access to systems they didn't know existed. Margaret stood slowly from the organ bench, her movements calm and deliberate. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who'd commanded respect in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. "Gentlemen," she said, her words carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "I need you to think very carefully about what you're doing here." The leader turned toward her, surprised to hear someone speaking with such composure. "Lady, sit down and shut up, or you'll be the first one to get hurt." "No," Margaret replied simply. "I won't." Something in her tone made the entire sanctuary go quiet. Even the children stopped crying, sensing that something fundamental had changed in the room's dynamic. "You see," Margaret continued, moving slowly away from the organ, "you've made several tactical errors. First, you chose a target with limited escape routes, which means you're trapped here just as much as we are. Second, you assumed everyone in this sanctuary would be helpless. And third, you didn't research the people you're threatening." The leader raised his weapon toward her. "I said sit down." Captain Margaret Hayes, U.S. Army Chaplain Corps, retired, she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd used to comfort dying soldiers and coordinate with military commanders. 12 years of service in Iraq and Afghanistan, Bronze Star recipient, and I've dealt with people like you before. The change in Margaret was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture had shifted, her voice had dropped into command tone, and suddenly the gentle church organist looked like someone who'd spent years in combat zones. The difference is, she continued, the soldiers I ministered to were fighting for something greater than themselves. You're just 3 cowards with guns terrorizing innocent people. The leader's weapon wavered slightly. This wasn't the response he'd expected from a church organist. Here's what's going to happen, Margaret said, taking another step forward. You're going to put down your weapons, walk out those doors, and disappear. Because if you don't, you're going to learn why the Army trained chaplains to protect their flocks, not just pray for them. Behind her, the congregation was watching in stunned silence. They'd never seen this side of their quiet organist, never imagined that the woman who played gentle hymns had once served in combat zones. The second gunman started to raise his weapon, but Margaret was already moving. The combat training she'd received as a military chaplain, designed to help her survive in hostile environments and protect non-combatants, kicked in with muscle memory that 12 years of peaceful retirement hadn't erased. What followed wasn't a gunfight. It was a very brief demonstration of why military chaplains received the same basic training as every other soldier, just with different primary responsibilities. Margaret moved through the sanctuary with the fluid precision of someone who'd learned to function under fire. She used the pews for cover, the architecture of the church for tactical advantage, and most importantly, her intimate knowledge of the building's layout to outmaneuver 3 men who'd made the mistake of threatening her congregation. When the police arrived 8 minutes later, they found 3 subdued attackers and 200 very shaken but unharmed congregants. Margaret was back at the organ bench, playing Amazing Grace, while Pastor Williams led the congregation in prayer. The official report noted that the threat had been neutralized by an individual with military training, but the specific details remained classified at the request of federal agencies who had interests in maintaining certain operational security protocols. The story spread through the community within hours, but not in the way Margaret had feared. Instead of being treated like a dangerous outsider, she found herself embraced even more tightly by the congregation. They understood now why they'd always felt safe in her presence, why she'd always seemed to know exactly what to do in difficult situations. Most importantly, they understood that her choice to serve through music instead of military service was itself a form of continued service, a commitment to healing instead of fighting, to building community instead of just protecting it. The following Sunday, the sanctuary was packed beyond capacity. People from other churches, other faiths, and no faith at all came to hear the organist who'd saved 200 lives. But Margaret played the same hymns she'd always played, with the same gentle precision as if nothing had changed, because nothing had changed, really. She was still Sister Margaret, the quiet organist who arrived early and stayed late. She was still the woman who chose the perfect music for every service and could comfort any heart with her playing. The only difference was that now the congregation knew what she'd always known, that service comes in many forms, that warriors can become healers, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with faith, courage, and the absolute certainty that some things are worth protecting. After the service, young Timothy Chen, whose family had been sitting in the front pew during the attack, approached Margaret at the organ. "Sister Margaret," he said quietly, "were you really a soldier?" "I was a chaplain," she replied, her hands still resting on the organ keys. "My job was to take care of soldiers' souls, just like my job now is to help take care of this congregation's spirit." "Is that why you weren't scared?" Margaret smiled, the same gentle smile the congregation had known for 15 years. "I was terrified, Timothy, but sometimes being brave means doing what needs to be done even when you're afraid." "Like David and Goliath?" "Exactly like David and Goliath. Sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be." Margaret continued serving as saint, Matthew's organist for many more years, but her role had quietly expanded. She helped train the church's security volunteers, advised on emergency procedures, and worked with local law enforcement to improve crisis response protocols for religious institutions. Most importantly, she continued playing the hymns that had brought comfort to generations of faithful souls, because she'd learned something important during her transition from military to civilian service. The greatest victories aren't always won on battlefields. Sometimes they're won in sanctuaries, one Sunday at a time, one hymn at a time, one act of faithful service at a time. Margaret Hayes had learned to serve God in foxholes and field hospitals, but she'd found her true calling in a small church sanctuary where she could protect souls with music instead of ministering to the wounded with prayers. Both were forms of service. Both were forms of love. Both were exactly what the world needed. She never spoke publicly about her military service, but she didn't hide it anymore. When asked, she'd simply say that she'd served her country abroad and now she was serving her community at home, and that both were expressions of the same calling to care for people in their greatest need. Because that's what real servants do. They find new ways to serve, new ways to protect, new ways to heal. They understand that the mission never really ends. It just finds new expressions, new purposes, new opportunities to make the world a little safer and a little more sacred. Margaret's hymns continued to fill St. Matthew's every Sunday morning, carrying the same message they'd always carried, that love is stronger than fear, that service is a form of worship, and that sometimes the most powerful protection comes not from weapons, but from the simple, sacred act of someone standing between danger and innocence, willing to risk everything to keep the light burning. This story was brought to you by True Human Tales. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet strength suggested hidden depths? Tell us about them in the comments below and let us know what city you're watching from today. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to support the channel. We honor the silent guardians who continue serving one hymn at a time.